At the wedding, I accidentally spilled a glass of wine on my DIL's mother's $50,000 dress. My name is Colin, I'm 65, and I honestly believed that by this age, I'd weathered enough storms to be unshakable. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for how quickly my son's wedding turned into the most humiliating day of my life, destroying 28 years of believing I had been a good mother. The reception looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Chandeliers casting golden light over tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece worth more than my monthly groceries. I'd put on my best navy dress, the one I saved for rare occasions, but it felt pitiful compared to the parade of couture gowns drifting through the hall. I was doing everything I could to blend in, not to embarrass Darren. He looked sharp in his tuxedo, hair perfectly styled, but his eyes were distant. A look I'd never seen when he was little, and I was his whole world. The accident happened during the toasts. My hands, slightly shaky from nerves, held a glass of red wine when someone brushed past me. The liquid seemed to float through the air before splattering across Norma's pale, glittering gown. $50,000! Calliope shrieked as she rushed to her mother's side. The custom Italian dress was now ruined by reception wine. Norma stared down at the spreading stain, her expression pure disgust. "You clumsy old woman!" Calliope's voice sliced through the air, freezing every conversation. "Do you even know what you've done?" I stammered, reaching for napkins, whispering apologies. And then the slap came. Hard and sudden, it knocked me backward, the sound echoing in the ballroom. "Don't touch her!" she yelled. "You've done enough. Clean it now, you useless old woman." My cheek burned, my pulse roared in my ears, and dozens of guests stared as though I were something foul. Then Darren laughed, not nervously, but with real amusement. "Mom's always been a klutz," he said to no one in particular. "Remember when she dropped my birthday cake? Some things never change." Something inside me didn't just crack. It went cold and lifeless. I knelt to collect shards of the broken glass, my fingers bleeding, as people just watched. Norma finally spoke with icy disdain. "The dry cleaning bill will be sent to you, though I doubt this can be saved." I said nothing, knowing my Social Security couldn't touch such a cost. When I finally stood up, glass shards cupped in my bleeding palm, I looked around the room one more time. Darren had already turned away, arm around Calliope's waist, comforting her as if she were the victim. The guests had resumed their conversations, but I caught the whispered words floating through the air. Embarrassing. Inappropriate. Why was she even invited? I walked toward the exit, my legs unsteady, my cheeks burning with shame. At the coat check, the young attendant handed me my worn jacket with a sympathetic smile, a gesture that somehow made the humiliation sting even deeper. The drive home was a haze. I couldn't remember starting the car, shifting into gear, or passing familiar streets. I only remember pulling into my driveway and sitting there in the dark with the engine running, unsure if I had the strength to step inside. When I finally entered, the house felt heavier than usual. The silence pressed down like a weight. My eyes wandered over the modest living room to the countless photos of Darren that covered every shelf, school portraits, graduations, birthdays, moments I had captured from behind the camera, never in the frame. I sank into the couch, staring at the wedding invitation I'd proudly displayed on the mantel for months. Once, the elegant script had filled me with joy. Now it mocked me. I hadn't been a welcome guest at that wedding. I'd been a duty they couldn't avoid. The worst part was realizing this wasn't sudden. The disrespect, the coldness, it had been growing for years. I'd simply been too blind, too hopeful, too desperate to keep my family together to admit it. That night, my cheek still throbbing, my chest hollow, I finally faced the truth. I wasn't Darren's mother anymore. I was a problem he'd learned to work around, something he had trained himself not to see. Sleep never came. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, memories I'd buried for decades breaking free. The wedding humiliation had opened a door I couldn't close again, and over I asked myself, Where did I go wrong? Darren's father walked out when he was 6. One Tuesday morning, he packed a bag and said he wasn't cut out for family life. I remember Darren standing at the window for hours, waiting for his dad to return. I told him his father was on a business trip. Each day, the lie stretched further until it became our reality. From then on, everything I did was for Darren. I worked double shifts at the factory, my hands raw from chemicals, my feet swollen after 12-hour days. When he needed new shoes for school, I wore my old ones another year. When he wanted to join Little League, I sold my grandmother's necklace to pay for his gear. I gave him the childhood I never had: piano lessons, summer camps, a college fund that grew slowly from my overtime pay. I wanted him to know he was loved, that one parent's abandonment didn't mean he was worth less. But at some point, my sacrifices became invisible, just part of the background. I remember his high school graduation. I'd worked extra shifts to buy him a good watch, something to wear for job interviews, and remember my pride. He barely looked at it. "Thanks, Mom," he said, already walking toward his friends. Weeks later, I found it still in the box under a pile of cards in his room. College brought more strain. State University wasn't good enough for him anymore, but my savings were small. I took out loans against the house. I cleaned offices on weekends. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could afford his textbooks. When he brought Kalia home junior year, I knew immediately she didn't approve of me. It was in the way her eyes swept over my small house, my secondhand furniture, my store-brand groceries. She was beautiful and polished, the daughter of successful people who summered in the Hamptons and never worried about money. "Your mother is so dedicated," she said to Darren that first visit, and somehow made dedication sound like a character flaw. I watched Keopi work on him slowly, carefully. She never said anything directly against me. She was far too smart for that. Instead, she would drop little remarks that planted seeds of doubt. My mother always says, "Successful men need to surround themselves with success." Over dinner. "It's about elevating your circle." Or with a smile that seemed kind but wasn't. "I love how close you are to your mom. But don't you think it's time to establish some independence? My therapist says healthy boundaries are so important." The changes in Darren were subtle at first. He started visiting less, our calls grew shorter. When I asked about his life, he'd tell me I wouldn't understand the pressures he faced or the refined world he was stepping into. After graduation, he got a job in finance, high salary, impressive title. I was proud. So when he asked to borrow $20,000 from my retirement savings for an investment opportunity, I didn't hesitate. He promised to repay me, with interest, in 6 months. 6 months became a year. A year became 2. When I finally asked about it, he looked at me like I was being petty. "Mom, that wasn't a loan," he said slowly, as though explaining to a child. "It was an investment in my future. I thought you understood." But I remembered it clearly, him calling it a loan, promising to pay it back. Somehow, in his mind, my sacrifice had turned into his right. Then came the engagement, and another request. The wedding would be costly, and though Norma was paying most of it, could I help with the honeymoon? Darren made it sound like a privilege to contribute. Another $15,000 gone, my vacation fund, my dream of seeing Europe one day, spent on their trip to Tuscany. Then came the down payment for their house, $45,000. Years of careful saving, of denying myself small pleasures, of working past retirement age despite aching bones and swollen feet. "You're investing in your grandchildren's future," Keopi had said sweetly when they asked. "Isn't that what grandmothers do?" I said yes, because I wanted those grandchildren. I wanted to be part of their lives, to have family again. I didn't realize I was trying to buy my way into a relationship that would never truly include me. Each time I gave them money, I told myself it was temporary, that once they were settled, they'd remember all I'd done. That Darren would see my sacrifices and appreciate them. Instead, every gift seemed to make me smaller in their eyes. I was no longer a mother giving out of love, but a woman paying for scraps of attention from her own son. The wedding invitation had been the final insult, though I hadn't seen it then. No mother of the groom title, no special seat, just my name tucked in with strangers at a back table. But I'd been so grateful to be invited, so hopeful for a fresh start, that I ignored the signs. Now, lying in my bed with my cheeks still tender from Calliope's slap, I finally saw the pattern clearly. I hadn't raised a son. I'd created a stranger who looked like my child, but had the heart of someone I didn't recognize. 3 weeks passed after the wedding, 3 weeks of silence from Darren. No thank you call, no check to see if I was okay, nothing. I moved through my days like a ghost, going through the motions without feeling alive. The house felt different now, tainted by the truth I could no longer ignore. Every photo of Darren seemed to mock me, every memory felt poisoned. I couldn't even look at his baby pictures without feeling sick to my stomach. That's when I decided to clean out the spare bedroom. I needed something to do with my hands. Anything to keep my mind busy, anything that didn't involve replaying the thought that I had utterly failed as a mother. The spare room had long since turned into a dumping ground, stacked high with boxes of papers, documents, and sentimental clutter I could never quite bring myself to throw away. I started with the closet, dragging out boxes I hadn't opened in years. Most of it was meaningless: old tax returns, expired warranties, Christmas cards from people I barely remembered. Then, shoved behind a pile of Darren's childhood school projects, I spotted a box marked Financial Records. My pulse quickened as I pulled it out. Inside was every scrap of paperwork from the loans and gifts I'd given Darren over the years. I'd kept them partly out of habit, partly because a quiet voice inside me had always whispered that one day I might need proof. The first paper I lifted out made my breath catch: the original agreement for the $20,000 Darren had borrowed for his so-called investment. In his own handwriting, it read, "I, Darren Mitchell, agree to repay my mother, Colin Mitchell, the sum of $20,000 within 6 months of this date, with 3% interest." His signature sat bold and confident at the bottom. This wasn't a gift. This wasn't an investment in his future. This was a formal loan, and one he had never repaid. I kept digging. My heart beat loud in my ears. The $45,000 house down payment, with loan written in his own handwriting on the check memo line. The $15,000 for the honeymoon, accompanied by another promissory note promising repayment in 2 years. But it was the last paper that nearly stopped my heart: a mortgage application Darren had filled out. Under outstanding debts, he had written, "Personal loan from C. Mitchell, $80,000, $80,000. He had openly acknowledged the debt to the bank, even using it to prove access to extra funds, yet never once mentioned paying me back. To him, I wasn't a lender. I was a bottomless resource to drain. I sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by paper, my hands trembling as the truth became undeniable. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a change of heart. This was calculated theft from his own mother. Every time Darren had come to me with a story, an opportunity, an emergency, a crisis, he had been lying. Not just lying, but manipulating, saying exactly what he knew would get me to open my wallet. I remembered him at my kitchen table 3 years earlier, wearing an expression of deep concern. "Mom, I hate to ask, but Collap's been having some health problems. We need money for specialists and tests insurance won't cover, just temporarily, until we're back on our feet." That day, I'd withdrawn $25,000, the last of my savings. 2 weeks later, I saw photos on Collie's social media, a weekend in Napa Valley, staying at a resort that charged more per night than I spent on a month's worth of groceries. When I asked about it, Darren had a ready answer. That was a gift from Calliope's parents. You know how they are. They don't understand when people say no. I believed him because the alternative was too painful to face. Now, with the papers spread around me, I grabbed my phone and began calculating. $80,000 in documented loans, unpaid. And that wasn't counting the undocumented emergencies, the car repair that turned out to be a down payment on a new model, the stolen laptop that needed replacing, the overdue utility bills that somehow never resulted in any service shutoffs that never came, the wedding expenses that went far beyond what any reasonable person would expect their retired mother to cover. When I added everything together, the total made me physically ill. Over the span of 15 years, I had given Darren more than $130,000. My entire life savings, my retirement cushion, my hopes of travel, of a comfortable old age, of leaving something meaningful behind when I was gone. All of it was now funding his perfect life. The big house, the luxury cars, the designer clothes draped over his wife's shoulders. And in exchange, I'd received a slap across the face at his wedding and 3 weeks of silence. But the money wasn't the worst part. The real pain came from realizing just how calculated it had been. How Darren had learned to read my vulnerabilities like a book. My love for him, my guilt over his father's abandonment, my constant need to feel useful, wanted, and relevant. He had taken those things and wielded them like weapons against me. I thought about all the times I'd apologized to him, for not having more to give, for daring to ask when he might repay me, for existing in ways that didn't fit into his new life with Collie. Every apology had been a small victory for him, proof that he could treat me however he wanted, and I'd still come back, smiling, ready to give again. I had trained him to see me as a victim, because I had played the role so well. The papers strewn across my floor told a story I hadn't been willing to read until now. My son hadn't simply forgotten to repay me over the years or become selfish as his career grew. No, he had planned this from the very start. He had systematically drained me while making me feel lucky to be included in his life at all. I gathered the documents and returned them neatly to the box. My hands were steady for the first time in weeks. The wound was still raw, deep, and likely permanent, but under it, something new was stirring, something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Not the messy, desperate anger of heartbreak, but the sharp, clean burn of righteous fury. The anger of someone who knows they've been played for a fool by the person they loved most. For the first time since the wedding, I felt fully awake, and for the first time in 15 years, I had no intention of apologizing for existing in my own son's life. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't grief keeping me up. My mind was clear, focused, racing through plans. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I had to do. The law offices of Henderson and Associates were housed in a restored Victorian downtown, the kind of place that inspired trust without the cold detachment of the steel and glass towers where Darren worked. I had found them online, searching for attorneys who specialized in family financial disputes and elder financial abuse. Margaret Henderson was about my age, with silver hair and warm eyes that turned razor sharp when I spread my documents across her conference table. She reviewed them slowly, methodically, jotting the occasional note on a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said at last, looking up from the pile, "this is remarkably thorough documentation. Your son created a very clear paper trail." "Is that good or bad for me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Even sitting here felt like a betrayal of every belief I'd held about family loyalty. "It's very good for you," Margaret replied firmly. "These aren't gifts. Regardless of what he's told you, these are documented loans with defined terms. Legally, he owes you this money." She pulled out a calculator and began adding. "Based on these records alone, the outstanding debt is roughly $83,000. That's not counting undocumented cash transfers, and it doesn't include interest on overdue amounts." $83,000. The figure seemed to hang in the air like a solid object. "What are my options?" I asked quietly. Margaret leaned back. "Several. We could begin with a formal demand letter giving him 30 days to respond with a repayment plan. If he refuses or ignores it, we can file a civil suit to recover the debt. With documentation this solid, I'm confident about our chances," Margaret said. And if you do nothing, he'll keep your money and keep treating you like you don't matter." Her tone was calm but unflinching. "Mrs. Mitchell," she continued, "I've seen cases like this before. Adult children who treat their parents like unlimited ATMs. It rarely stops until the parent draws a firm line." I thought about Darren's mocking laugh at the wedding, about Colopy's slap, about the 3 weeks of silence since. If I go through with this, there's no going back, is there? He'll never forgive me. Margaret studied my face. "Can I ask you something? When was the last time your son did something that required your forgiveness?" The question landed in my chest like a blow. I started to answer, and couldn't. I couldn't remember the last time Darren had apologized, admitted fault, or even acknowledged hurting me. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret said gently but firmly, "you're not destroying a relationship by asking for respect and honesty. You're trying to salvage what might still be saved. Right now, you're not his mother. You're his victim. Is that the role you want to keep playing?" I picked up the pen and signed the retainer agreement, my hand only slightly unsteady. Margaret would begin with a formal demand letter, professional, direct, and impossible to dismiss. Darren would have 30 days to respond with payment or a workable repayment plan. "What if he calls me directly?" I asked, as I wrote the check for her fee. "Don't take his calls," she said without hesitation. "From now on, all communication goes through this office. That's why you hired me." Walking back to my car felt different, lighter, cleaner, as though the air itself had changed. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't carrying the dead weight of confusion and self-blame. I had a plan, and the legal action was only step one. Over the next few days, I made small but powerful changes. I called the bank and set up automatic bill payments, so I would never again feel dependent on Darren if money got tight. I changed my emergency contact everywhere: doctor's offices, the bank, insurance policies, replacing Darren's name with my neighbor Helen's. She was practical, reliable, and most importantly, she wouldn't use a crisis as an excuse to make me feel like a burden. I cleaned out the freezer, tossing the casseroles I'd been saving for Darren's visits. He hadn't eaten my cooking in more than 2 years, always claiming he and Colopy had already eaten or were on some new diet. I packed away most of the photos of him in the living room. Not all of them. I wasn't ready for that yet, but enough so my home began to feel like mine again, instead of a shrine to someone who couldn't be bothered to call. The most difficult change was with my phone. For years I'd kept the ringer on at all hours just in case Darren needed me. Now I turned it to silent after 9 p.m. and didn't check messages until after my morning coffee. The first night felt wrong, like I was abandoning my post, but by the third night, I realized how much better I slept without the constant dread of his calls. A week after meeting with Margaret, the demand letter was ready. She read it to me over the phone, her tone precise and businesslike. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, this letter serves as formal demand for payment of outstanding loans made by your mother, Colin Mitchell, between 2010 and 2024. Based on documentation in our possession, you currently owe Mrs. Mitchell $83,247 in principal, plus applicable interest. You have 30 days from receipt of this letter to contact our office to arrange payment or establish a payment plan. Failure to respond will result in civil action to recover the debt." "It sounds so official," I said. "That's the point," Margaret replied. "This is no longer a family matter. This is business." She was right. Somewhere along the way, without me noticing, that's exactly what my relationship with Darren had turned into. A business arrangement where I provided the capital and he gave nothing in return. The demand letter was sent by certified mail the next day. This way, I would know precisely when Darren received it and when the 30-day countdown began. For the first time in months, I made plans that had nothing to do with his schedule or needs. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center. I booked a doctor's appointment I had been avoiding because I didn't want to ask Darren for a ride. I even did my grocery shopping just for myself, instead of keeping extra food on hand for visits that never came. The silence from him didn't sting anymore. It didn't feel like being abandoned. It felt like space, breathing room, a chance to remember who I had been before I became nothing more than Darren's personal bank account. I started taking evening walks through my neighborhood, something I'd stopped doing long ago so I wouldn't miss his calls. The movement felt good, and I noticed things I'd ignored for years. New houses, seasonal changes, neighbors I'd never spoken to, but who waved when I passed. 3 days before Darren was due to receive the letter, my phone rang. It was Helen, my neighbor. "Colin, honey, there's a young woman at your door. Says she's your daughter-in-law. I told her you were at the store, but she's been sitting in that fancy car for over an hour." Calliope. My stomach tightened, not with dread this time, but with anticipation. If she was here early, it meant they already knew something was coming. "Thanks for letting me know, Helen. I'll be home in a few minutes," I said. In truth, I wasn't at the store. I was sitting in a cafe 2 blocks away, reading a paperback I'd bought on impulse. I turned another page, finished my coffee slowly, and let her wait. When I finally pulled into my driveway, Collie was leaning against her pristine white BMW, scrolling on her phone with the kind of bored posture people perfect when they're used to the world waiting for them. She glanced up as I stepped out of my car, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. "Colin," she said brightly, a little too brightly, "I was hoping we could talk." I took my time gathering my purse and the book, making sure she watched me move at my own pace. "Talk about what? The wedding? What happened?" She tucked a glossy, highlighted strand of hair behind her ear. "I think there might have been some misunderstandings." I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, leaving it open. She followed, her heels tapping against my hardwood floors. In my small, comfortable living room, surrounded by worn but well-loved furniture, she looked as out of place as I had felt at her wedding. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, slipping into the polite hostess role I'd been taught as a girl, "Water would be nice." She perched on the edge of my couch like it might leave a mark on her designer trousers. I went to the kitchen, taking my time filling a glass with ice water and arranging some crackers on a plate I doubted she'd touch. When I came back, she was scanning the room, her gaze lingering on the family photos I hadn't yet packed away. "So many pictures of Darren," she said, taking the water. "You must miss having him around." It was bait. I recognized it immediately. She was here to gather information, to figure out why I hadn't called, why I wasn't playing my usual role as the apologetic mother. "Actually, I've been keeping busy," I replied, settling into my armchair. "I've started taking classes, reading more. It's surprising how much time you have when you're not constantly worrying about other people's problems." Her smile faltered. "That's wonderful. Self-care is so important." She paused, clearly building up to her point. "Darren mentioned you might be feeling a little isolated lately since the wedding." "Did he?" I kept my voice neutral. "How thoughtful of him to notice," I said evenly. "We were thinking maybe we could have a family dinner soon," Calliope suggested. "Clear the air, just the 3 of us." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice like we were co-conspirators. "Between us, I think Darren feels awful about what happened. He's just too proud to be the one to reach out first." I almost laughed. Even now, after 3 weeks of silence, they were still using the same old tactics, trying to guilt me into making the first move, painting Darren as the wounded party who needed protecting. "That's interesting," I said. "What exactly does he feel terrible about?" Collie blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. "Well, the whole situation. It was such a stressful day. Emotions were high." "So, he feels bad about laughing when you slapped me?" The question landed between us like a stone. A flush crept up her neck, her composure slipping. "Colin, you have to understand, that dress was incredibly expensive, and in the moment, In the moment, you assaulted a 65-year-old woman over an accident, and my son thought it was funny, I said, my tone steady, factual. I'm curious, what part of that does he feel terrible about? Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her water glass. I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I came here to apologize, to make things right. Did you? I tilted my head. Because what I've heard so far sounds more like a justification for your behavior and a suggestion that Darren's pride is the reason he won't apologize for enjoying my humiliation. Her mouth opened, then shut. For the first time since I'd known her, Calliope seemed at a loss for words. Let me ask you something, I continued. In the 3 weeks since your wedding, has Darren once asked about me? Wondered if I was okay? If I was hurt? Of course he has, she said quickly, but her eyes betrayed her. What exactly did he say? I pressed. Another pause. He said, you were probably fine, that you're tough. Tough. That was their way of excusing their cruelty, not seeing me as strong, but as someone durable enough to take whatever they dished out and still come back. You're right, I said. I am tough. Tougher than you think. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I saw Darren get out, his expression grim. You called him, I said flatly. It wasn't a question. Calliope looked faintly embarrassed. I thought it might be better if we were all here together for this conversation. The front door opened without so much as a knock. Darren walked in like he still owned the place, his stride confident and proprietary. He stopped short when he saw us, clearly expecting to find his wife in tears and his mother apologizing. Mom, he said, voice controlled. Calliope said you were talking. We were discussing her apology, I replied, though I'm still waiting to hear it. His jaw tightened. I think we're all a little emotional here. Maybe we should take a step back. I'm not emotional, I said. I'm calmer than I've been in years. He moved behind the couch, placing his hands on Calliope's shoulders in a gesture meant to show unity. Look, what happened at the wedding was unfortunate, but accidents happen, and people react differently under stress. Accidents happen, I repeated. Is that what we're calling it? The wine spill was an accident, Darren said firmly. Everything else was just a reaction in the moment. I stood, and both of them seemed to shrink slightly. You know what, Darren? You're right. Accidents do happen. Like me accidentally finding some very interesting documents while I was cleaning this week. Something flickered in his eyes. What kind of documents? Oh, just some old paperwork, loan agreements, promissory notes, papers I'd forgotten I'd even kept. I smiled pleasantly. Amazing how different things look when you review them with fresh eyes. Darren's complexion drained of color. Calliope glanced between us, sensing the sudden shift in power but clearly not grasping the details. Mom, if this is about money... Money? I cut him off. Why would this be about money? You've made it very clear over the years that family doesn't keep score. The silence between us stretched tight. Darren was calculating, no doubt trying to gauge exactly how much I knew and what I might do with it. Maybe we should continue this another time, he said finally, once everyone's had a chance to cool down. Actually, I think my temperature is just right, I replied evenly. But you're welcome to leave any time. It was the first time in 20 years I had dismissed my son from my home, the first time I made it crystal clear that this was my space, and I controlled it. Calliope shot to her feet. I think we should go. Darren hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave without wrangling some kind of reassurance that I would go back to being the compliant, manageable mother he was used to. We'll talk soon, he said, moving toward the door. Will we? I asked, my tone light but pointed. You haven't called me in 3 weeks, but now suddenly we'll talk soon? They left without another word, Calliope's heels clicking across the porch like gunshots. I watched from the window as they stopped by their cars, engaging in what looked like a tense argument. Darren kept gesturing toward my house, his face tight with frustration. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Darren's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, then a third time. I turned the phone off and made myself a cup of tea. The certified demand letter landed in Darren's hands on a Tuesday. I knew because Margaret called me at exactly 10:47 a.m. to confirm delivery. By 11:15, my phone was lighting up nonstop. I didn't answer. The messages began angry. "Mom, what the hell is this?" Then shifted to pleading. "Mom, please call me back. We need to talk about this." And finally to threatening. "Mom, I'm coming over if you don't pick up." By Wednesday, he was pounding on my door. I watched from the kitchen window, calm as I made my lunch, while my son melted down on my front porch. "I know you're in there," he shouted. "Your car is in the driveway." Helen, my neighbor, appeared by her fence, curiosity written all over her face. When Darren spotted her, he tried to compose himself, smoothing his hair and lowering his voice. "Have you seen my mother today?" he asked, attempting casual. "She's not receiving visitors today," Helen called back, and in that moment, I could have kissed her. Thursday. It was Calliope's turn, tears streaming down her flawlessly made-up face. She stood in my driveway in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly expenses, sobbing about how I was destroying their family. I opened the window just enough to speak through. "The same way you destroyed my dress at your wedding?" She stopped crying instantly. "That's not the same thing." "You're right," I said. "Your dress cost $50,000. I'm only asking for $83,000. Quite the bargain." I closed the window and went back to my watercolor painting. Friday was the deadline Margaret had set for their response. At 4:30 p.m., my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is David Brennan from Brennan Kowalski and Associates. I'm representing your son in this matter." A lawyer. Instead of paying me back, or even calling to resolve things like family, they'd lawyered up. "You'll need to speak with my attorney," I said. "Margaret Henderson at Henderson and Associates." "Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps we could resolve this without involving the courts. Family disputes are so much better handled privately." "Mr. Brennan, your client stopped being my family the moment he thought it was funny to watch his wife assault me. Now he's just someone who owes me money." I hung up and immediately called Margaret. "They've hired a lawyer," I told her. "That tells us everything we need to know about their intentions," she said. "Actually, it tells us they're scared. People don't hire attorneys for debts they believe they don't owe. They hire them when they know they're caught." The civil suit was filed the following Monday. Within hours, Darren left 3 voicemails, each more frantic than the last. "Mom, you're making this worse than it needs to be. We can work something out if you'll just talk to me. Do you have any idea what this lawsuit is going to cost me? How it's going to affect my career if this gets out?" "Fine. You want to play hardball? We'll see how this works out for you." That last message told me everything I needed to know about who my son truly was, stripped of all my years of denial. The case took 8 months to resolve. 8 months where Darren tried every manipulative tactic he knew. Guilt-laden letters about how I was ruining his marriage and reputation, relatives calling to plead his case, even showing up on Mother's Day with flowers, as if a bouquet could erase decades of financial exploitation. I didn't respond to any of it. Every word went through Margaret, who handled his theatrics with professional detachment. The settlement conference was held on a gray February morning in a sterile conference room downtown. Darren sat across from me in an expensive suit, flanked by his attorney, looking noticeably older, new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at his wedding. "Mrs. Mitchell," his lawyer began smoothly, "my client is prepared to offer $30,000 to settle this matter and move on." "Counteroffer," Margaret said instantly. "Full amount owed, plus interest and attorney fees, $97,400. Darren's face went pale. "That's impossible. I don't have that kind of cash." "You had it when you took it from your mother," Margaret replied evenly. "Figure it out." After 6 hours of back and forth, he agreed to a deal: $50,000 up front, the remainder in $2,000 monthly installments for 2 years, with his house as collateral. As we signed the documents, Darren gave me a look I'd never seen before. Not affection, not warmth, but the begrudging respect you give to an opponent who's proven they can't be pushed around. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. "Destroying our relationship over money?" I met his eyes. "I didn't destroy anything, Darren. I just stopped pretending it existed." The first payment arrived exactly on schedule. So did the second and the third. Darren never missed one, which told me he'd always had access to the money. He'd simply never felt the need to repay me because there had never been consequences before. I used the initial $50,000 to fulfill a dream I'd had for decades: a month-long trip to Ireland. I stayed in charming bed and breakfasts, wandered through ancient castles, and met strangers who knew nothing of my past and saw only a woman worth listening to. In a pub in County Cork, I met Eleanor, a retired teacher from Dublin, traveling alone for the first time since her husband's death. We spent 3 days exploring together, and when she mentioned wanting to visit America, I invited her to stay with me. "You have family in California?" she asked. "I have a son," I said, "but we're not close." It was the first time I'd said it without feeling shame. My son and I weren't close, and that was his choice, not my failure. Eleanor visited 6 months later, and we spent 2 weeks touring the wine country, hiking in national parks, and discovering that friendship at our age could be even richer than it had been in our youth. We made plans to travel together again, too. Places I'd never imagined I'd have the courage, or the means, to visit. Darren's monthly payments arrived like clockwork. We never spoke, but each check felt like a quiet victory. Not because of the amount, but because it meant something I'd once thought impossible. My son was being held accountable for his actions. A year after the settlement, Helen mentioned she'd noticed Darren driving past the house a few times, but never stopping. "Maybe he's thinking about reconciling," she suggested softly. "Maybe," I said. "But reconciliation requires admitting you were wrong, not just missing what you lost." By then, I wasn't bitter anymore. The anger that had carried me through the legal fight had faded into something steadier and more enduring: acceptance. I accepted that I had raised a son capable of treating his mother as poorly as a stranger might. I accepted that my love for him wasn't enough to make him a better man. I accepted that some relationships can't be repaired, only endured. The house felt lighter now. I'd redecorated with colors I loved, instead of the safe, neutral shades I'd chosen to fit in. I'd replaced Darren's photos with pictures from my travels, images of the woman I was becoming, not the one I used to be. On my 67th birthday, I treated myself to a full day at the spa. Sitting in the massage chair, looking out over a sunlit garden, I realized something extraordinary. I was happy. Not the fragile, conditional happiness that relied on Darren's approval, but a calm, enduring contentment that was entirely mine. That evening, Eleanor called from Dublin to wish me a happy birthday. We talked for over an hour about her upcoming visit, the cooking class we wanted to take together, and the little apartment she was considering renting nearby so she could stay for longer trips. When we hung up, I poured a glass of wine and sat in my garden, watching the sunset streak the sky with pink and gold. Somewhere across town, Darren was living his life without me in it, and for the first time, it felt like his loss, not mine. The last payment arrived exactly on schedule, along with a short note in Darren's handwriting. Debt paid in full. I deposited the check and threw the note away. Some debts, I had learned, could never truly be settled, but some freedoms are worth any cost. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.